Greetings, good afternoon from here in Washington. Good evening in London and Europe, and hello to our viewers from all over the world. I'm Fred Kempe. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And it's my privilege to welcome David Lammy, the UK Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, to this virtual Atlantic Council event. And that title, if I can translate that into other words, David, it means that you would be the Foreign Secretary if the opposition Labour Party wins the coming elections, as polls at the moment suggest it would. Let me read from the New York Times by way of introduction, the second paragraph of just a really wonderful profile of David. Quote, a son of Guyanese immigrants who grew up poor in working class London. He spent summers with relatives in Brooklyn and Queens, working at Con Edison before earning a master's degree at Harvard Law School and befriending Barack Obama, for whom he canvassed in Chicago during his first presidential campaign. He's also struck up a relationship with Senator J.D. Vance, the Ohio Republican, who's very much part of the Trump team. We'll come back to those issues in a minute. But first and foremost, David, it's a pleasure to see you again. I've so much enjoyed our conversations over time. And also, you are from Tottenham. And when I lived in London, the Hotspurs were my favorite team, and I spent some time at the stadium there. That, well, a wonderful stadium as well. But so welcome to our show.
Fred, thank you. And can I just say it's fantastic to be on Atlantic Council platform again, to spend time with you. We've spent time in Munich, we've spent time in Washington. Here we are, I'm in London, you're there. And of course, anybody that supports the best, you would call it, soccer team that we have here in the UK, Tottenham, is a friend of mine. So it's wonderful to spend some time with you today.
Many a happy hour was spent there. So as Shadow Foreign Secretary, David leads in the development of the Labour Party's foreign policy during a time, and it's no news to this audience, which is a very knowing audience, tumultuous time, certainly in the UK, but in Europe, in the transatlantic relationship around the world, people are calling it one of the greatest threats to the global system since the 1930s, wars in Europe, Mideast, tensions with China, technological competition, questions of climate, questions of the global South, all of which, by the way, were dealt with in a really wonderful essay in Foreign Affairs that David Lammy wrote, which I urge everyone listening in to take a look at. But maybe I'll start there, David. You laid out the Labour Party's vision for Britain's engagement with a term I hadn't heard before. So first of all, I'm interested if you coined it, but I also wonder if you could give a brief description of what you describe as progressive realism, and maybe as your organizing principle, and maybe how it would differ from the current organizing principle for the Conservative government.
Well, look, Britain's been through a very difficult period. After the decision to leave the European Union, our country has appeared often divided. We've had no growth, slow growth here in the UK economy, and we've burned through 5 prime ministers in a very short space of time. This is not the United Kingdom that most Americans would recognize. And for that reason, I had to really dig hard to think out, what should be our guiding light if we have the privilege of serving after a general election, which will be called at some point this year. And in doing that, I wanted to think about our country's history and my party's history in government looking back over time. I, of course, started with the government that I was part of, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's administration. I was a junior minister at Justice and Education over that period, thinking back to how the world looked. It's unbelievable. Britain, in 1997, when Tony Blair came to office, had an economy bigger than China and India's combined. We still ran a colony called Hong Kong in China. Today, things have changed vastly. But at that time, our Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, was the first Foreign Secretary to make climate a central plank of our foreign policy. And this was a period also, you remember, then Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. The genocide in Rwanda had happened just a few years previous. So this was a period also where the world was reflecting on a human rights approach. So in that sense, we're proud of that progressive tradition which Robin Cook brought to bear. But our leader, Keir Starmer, gave me this job and he sent me out into the world. I've been on 45, 46 trips, 40 countries over this last couple of years, spent a lot of time thinking about the challenging issues that you set out. And I've really been guided by Ernest Bevin, great foreign secretary just after the Second World War. He was in Clem Attlee's administration. He was the foreign secretary that birthed NATO and the incredible alliance that came out of the Second World War, and of course guided us through the Cold War, and also made Britain, and it divided our party for a period, absolutely commit to the nuclear deterrent. He was a realist in tough times. And so, yes, I have an outlook that is progressive, of course. The climate emergency to me is hugely important. The rule of law, the rules-based order that has stood for so much and our two great countries have worked together on so closely matters. So it's progressive, but realist about the world as we find it, not as we wish it to be, realist about the partners that we need. Say in the Middle East, when we look at the problems in Israel, Gaza, we have to work with our friends in Saudi Arabia and UAE and across the region. And realist too in our approach to Ukraine and the real problems posed by Russia and the tyranny we're seeing from Putin, and indeed the huge challenge that China presents to our security, particularly over this next period. And that's why I set out an agenda in my Foreign Affairs article that I described as a progressive realism.
Thank you for that, David. We'll go through some of those issues that you've just outlined. Maybe we'll start with the U.S. relationship, but also let me grab upon this realist notion. The realist notion also is matching resources with goals. And so you have, obviously, we have a Ukraine issue at the door, European security issues that are the neighborhood. On the other hand, the UK has also become more engaged in the Indo-Pacific. There's some talk in some quarters of the US that we should pay much less attention to Europe and more attention to the Indo-Pacific. The Atlantic Council's view is that you have to be able to do both because President Xi will be looking at what's going on in Ukraine. But from your own standpoint and the resources of the UK, how are you going to balance those two theaters? And then through saying that, how do you view what's been called the special relationship with the United States, and where would you think you would want to emphasize your relationship with the United States most in the world?
Well, let's start with the special relationship. The Five Eyes system and the intelligence capability that we have combined with our allies in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand is not just of tremendous strength to us. It's of tremendous strength to the global community and the rules-based order. And I saw this in real time when I came into this role. And in our system, it does mean that certain intelligence can be shared. And I saw that we saw together what Putin was about to do in Ukraine. And it was really interesting because when I was speaking to colleagues in Europe, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, they did not recognize what we were telling them until we shared that intelligence with them. And then they simply could not believe it was about to happen. So our combined intelligence capability and the way our military worked together, and look, let's just look at how we supported each other and to ensure that we did not see regional escalation when Iran sent those drones over Israel and Jordan. Together, our military capability made sure that they were destroyed and civilian life was not lost on the ground. This is immense. This is a very, very important combined strength that we have. That is a special relationship. And it doesn't matter who's in the White House or who's in number 10. It's a special relationship that endures, and long may it continue. And it will certainly continue if we have the privilege of winning the next general election. Now, it is the case that we have to refresh from time to time, looking at the threats that we face across the globe, the nature of our special relationship. And I think the central underpinning of that at the moment is also to look at what's just happened with AUKUS, a huge important development there in the Indo-Pacific, huge capability, hugely important to security in the region, and this renewed combination with Australia, and we're now seeing the Japanese and others expressing a real interest in AUKUS. So that is central over the next few years. And you'll understand in our system, that is a bipartisan commitment over more than a generation. But it has been important for us, now that we are outside of the European Union, to be able to join CPTPP, to be a partner country of ASEAN, to have a foothold in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that the United States, given it has decided not to step into those arrangements, recognizes the importance of the UK having a presence there. But of course, let's be under no doubt, with war here in Europe and with successive American presidents urging Europe to do more in terms of defense spending and burden sharing, this is hugely important over this time. We can all see that the United States has got to be focused in the Indo-Pacific. It does mean a heavier load here in Europe. We welcome, of course, NATO, and we welcome, of course, the huge contribution, 75% that the United States makes to that important alliance. But the UK and France combined represent 50% of European defense at this moment. And that's why we are a country, we're a P5 country, we're the sixth richest economy in the world. It's important that we play our role, and we intend to continue to do that over this next period.
Thank you for that. Just for people listening in, I should have said this at the outset. This is a short, we only have 30 minutes, and so we're going to be concise. But for the audience, I will look for your questions, and you can submit them at askac.org, and you can follow along on X, formerly Twitter, with the Atlantic Council, and at AC Europe, at Atlantic Council, at AC Europe. Your prime minister, your current prime minister, Rishi Sunak, was just on a visit to Poland, talked about the UK increasing defense spending to 2.5% of GDP 2030, surpassing the NATO threshold. I know you're not the shadow defense secretary or shadow foreign secretary, but the question that comes out of this for me is, would a Labour government be any different in this respect, or would they also go in this direction? be any difference toward Ukraine, which I guess gets to the point of what are the 2 or 3 biggest differences you would see between a Labour foreign policy and a conservative foreign policy, if one can put it that way?
Well, look, let me say that the 2.5%, as soon as the fiscal situation allows, is hugely important. We've said we'd have a strategic defensive review begin on day one. We think that's important. Sadly, the reason we say that that's important is because our armed forces have been reduced in size to the lowest number since the Napoleonic Wars. We've had too many of our armed forces complain about a lack of kit, and we've had some real problems with the housing that we asked them to live in. So we really want to make a big commitment to our armed forces, to our veterans. The 2.5% is essential in order to get us to that place. And how quickly we can get there, in some senses, will be dependent on that defense strategic review that we do when we begin. We have not sought here in the UK to be overly partisan about issues of foreign affairs and defense. It's just not been the approach that we have taken as an opposition. So we have said that we will stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, and we mean it. We mean it because we think that we are facing down in Vladimir Putin a long-term systemic threat to Europe. And of course, if he wins there, you can expect him to make further challenges to the Baltic states. So we are absolutely crystal clear about that. We welcome, of course, Finland and Sweden coming into NATO. But we have taken issue with the dirty money and the kleptocracy that we've seen in the system. And we think there's more to do there. We want to see more around sanctions enforcement over this next period, and we've taken issue with that. And we're concerned that we're taking so much time to deal with this issue of repurposing Russian assets to be put to the cause as we rebuild Ukraine when this war is complete. And of course, we also recognize that there are real challenges in the Middle East. And it's important that we keep hold of, we think, a 2-state solution as we look at those challenges. And with China, we have lamented the fact that we've seen a big inconsistency in the UK over this period. We had the golden era just a few years ago under David Cameron. He was then doing deals with the Chinese. He's now back as our foreign secretary. We've bounced around between Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson. We need a sustained, consistent approach to the Chinese. And we've been very clear, we'll be very clear-eyed about that. Security is important and comes first. Of course, there are areas where we can cooperate, climate being one of them. But we have to be prepared to challenge where we disagree.
So let me ask you, let me follow up on the China issue. You've promised that Labour would complete an audit of the UK-China relationship within the first 100 days should Labour enter government. Could you talk about what that audit would aim to achieve and preview to a certain extent what you think Britain's strategy with China should be?
Well, we need that audit because we have to have a full cross-government approach to China, not just a Foreign Office approach to China or indeed a Treasury approach to China. It's got to be across the whole frontier. And that's why we say we'd have a full audit on day one. As the opposition, we're not privy to some of that intelligence and that understanding that you uniquely have if you are in government. I've said very clearly that the 3 C's guide us at this stage, and that is that there are areas where we will challenge, and Xinjiang and some of what we see there is one of them. There are areas where we must compete, and our security must come first, working closely with allies such as the United States, and ensuring that key technologies do not find themselves into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and cause us problems back home. And there are areas where we can cooperate, trade. Clearly, both our countries have huge trade with China, and we recognize that. Climate, pandemic, those are issues on which we do want to see cooperation. I've been impressed what I've seen in the States, which is a lot of engagement with China, but a pretty clear-eyed, robust response. No one's in any doubt as to where we stand in the ground. And that's what I'd like to see us replicate if we have the privilege of serving after the next general election.
Thank you for that, David. Let's talk about another relationship that hasn't been called special, but it certainly is significant, and that is with the European Union. Clearly, your party was not a proponent of Brexit, but we are in Brexit. I guess the first question is, do you think that would ever be revisited by a Labour government? But beyond that, how do you see the relationship unfolding, particularly in a defense situation? I saw that you praised President Macron's recent speech where he wanted to build a deeper relationship with the UK.
Well, look, we're outside of the European Union. That decision has been made, and we've said that we are not re-entering the European Union. But my party has not got the divides on our friends in Europe and our allies in Europe that the current administration have. We want a security defense pact with the European Union. Frankly, it's clear that the United States would like us to work closer together. And if we're serious about burden sharing, serious about Putin, Europe needs that. And so a defense pact and a security pact is really important. We do want to have proper dialogue with the European Union. It's extraordinary that this government has rejected even that at this time of real concerns around climate, real concerns around security issues coming up from the Horn of Africa into the European continent, and of course with war in Europe as well. And we want to review the trade agreement that we struck with the European Union if we come to office. That was timetabled for 2025, and we want to approach that in a very serious way with our European partners and improve that, of course, where we can. That will be subject to negotiation. But the bottom line is these are our allies. When we talk about Europe and the United States and the UK, we're talking about a free world. That's something that we should cherish and hold dear at this time of rising autocracy across the world, and less people enjoying that freedom, a freedom that we take for granted. So we have a hand outreach to Europe to work in partnership where we can, but absolutely clear, we're not going back into the single market, we're not going back into the customs union, but we want a good, strong working partnership. The world needs us to have one.
So looking at that, questions come in from Moritz Ludwig. Will your vision of progressive realism position the UK closer to the EU when it comes to international climate cooperation? Another question from Scott Bade of Eurasia Group suggested the Conservatives have been pretty good at latching on to soft power transnational issues like climate, international aid, AI. How would Labour be different on those issues?
Well, look, AI, the world needs leadership. I'm grateful to see the conversation that's going on in the United States. An initiative that was started by Rishi Sunak, we welcome, and we will continue that. And you could go on then to quantum. The regulatory environment for these things is hugely important. We want innovation. This is a great opportunity. Let's be clear about that. But
the Prime Minister has taken quite a lead on AI as well, hasn't he?
He has taken a lead, and that is something that would continue under us and under Keir Starmer. I have no doubt about that. We want the UK to be back at the top table on the climate issue. We think that this is really, really important. Again, we've seen huge strides. The United States has been quite unbelievable with the acceleration over the last few years. And it's been interesting when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, also to see, in a sense, with the manufacturing and the opportunities that are going on now in red states, indeed, that trend is something that's going to continue. And we want to see how, both working with Europe, of course, but the United States, we can take that work forward back at the top table on issues of climate as we head towards the Brazil COP in 2025. So look, we think that the UK has been a traditional bridge sometimes between the European Union and the United States. We share a language, of course, when we talk about our friendship, our deep, special relationship with the United States. But we are, of course, on the European continent. That puts us in a special place. I was very sad when I was coming to Washington just over a year ago, and there was big concern that was bipartisan about the position that the UK had taken on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the undermining of the situation in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. We've got to put that stuff behind us. You won't see a Labour government behaving in that way.
Thank you for that, David. Let's talk a little bit about the U.S. Your election in the U.S. and UK. Go a bit deeper on this. Your election is probably going to come very close to our own. You could have a Trump administration. You could have a Biden administration. You, as I said in the introduction, you've had a relationship with the Obama administration. You're in the Labor Party. On the other hand, you've spent some time with Secretary Pompeo, Trump's Secretary of State, former CIA director. You built a relationship with J.D. Vance. This is one of my favorite parts of the New York Times piece, where you talk about his best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, and his background, which bears parallels to your own growing up story. And you said that you were reduced to tears when you were reading it. And then when you talked to JD, you talked about you're both quite strong Christians and share also a tough upbringing. So talk to me about what difference a Biden or Trump administration is going to make in how a Labor-led UK administration can partner with the United States.
Well, the bottom line is that the global challenges we face need us both to work closely together, and we will work closely together, whoever is in the White House or number 10. That's the first starting point in the importance of the special relationship. But the truth is, I'm speaking to you as a centrist. I'm in the center of the political family, if you like. I'm a Christian. So I understand something of small c conservatism. I understand what that means. And so I can find common ground with people like J.D. Vance. I understand what it means to come from a working class background. I know what it means to look into a community and see it overrun by drugs. I have some affinity for some of the challenges that we see in Middle America at this time, and you see them also in Middle England, which is why, in the end, I can converse with J.D. Vance. I loved his book. I understand some of where he's coming from. And with Donald Trump, there was a lot of noise in that last administration, but it did coincide with the sort of high point in social media and Twitter, and it's frantic. I think that's died down a bit in the last few years. And I think it's also important to not get too carried away with the rhetoric. That's what I was saying to European friends at the Munich Security Conference. And actually, look what happened. The truth is the Trump administration actually committed more money to NATO. They sent the first javelins to Ukraine. And there were more troops stationed in Europe in that period. So sometimes you've got to separate some of the political noise. Maybe it's easier for me because I've lived in America. I've studied in America. I've been going to America. I've been to America more times than I've been to France. So I know it's a noisy place. My own family's noisy. But the actual truth of the commitment to the free world, beyond doubt.
That's just a terrific answer. Let's maybe close with Global South. It's something that plays a big role in the things that you've written about, talked about. How would your government be different in its approach to Global South than the current government? But maybe more than that, even so, how much are you concerned about the direction of the Global South? We've seen it hasn't been very supportive in questions of Ukraine. We sometimes are just absent and others fill the vacuum. I know we're at the end of our time, but I'd love to hear your view on the Global South as a way toward a close.
Well, look, thank you for this question. We need to recognize that many in the Global South are hedging. They're hedging between the United States and its allies and China. Russia is causing havoc in parts of the continent of Africa. And we need to do better in terms of the Global South for sure. Back in the Tony Blair days, we made huge commitments to development and aid. And of course, Britain has a history with so much of the Global South and the Commonwealth particularly. I think today, it's not so much about development, it's about partnership, it's about trade, and we've got to be in those conversations, understanding that China's Belt and Road has happened, recognizing that there are new important, I mean, look at India, huge superpower now, effectively, a massive growth. I was there a few weeks ago, and that trajectory will continue. And of course, the Gulf, countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey in its own region, Brazil playing an outsized role. So I do think it's important that we are not just isolated in terms of what's going on in our own countries, but we're looking outward and we're recognizing that the Global South particularly, and trade and opportunity and jobs for their young people, working with them in partnership where we can, is hugely in our own national interest, but I also believe in the interest of the free world.
So, David Lammy, the UK Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Europe Center, which is hosting this, its Senior Director, Jörn Fleck, and James Batchick for their great work. And if you don't mind, David, I'd like to send a little bit of a message of thanks as well to someone who's working with you, who was really one of our top people here at the Atlantic Council for a while, Ben Judah, and you're lucky to have him on your team. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you so much, Fred, and it's wonderful to have stolen Ben from you.